Hello friends and welcome to Noble Literature classes. This is going to be a very essential lecture for all of you, those who are seriously studying for UGC NET English Literature exam, because this series or this lecture will complete all your study of British literature. I have taken all the major writers and all their major works, and instead of just giving you the names, I am also going to talk in detail about those writers and also about those works. So bear with me. I don't know how long this course can be. It can be 4, 5, 6 hours, and it is certainly not meant to be studied at one go, in a one go. You have to study it in short breaks. If you are feeling lethargic, if you are feeling out of interest, then just stop the video, go back, come back whenever you are feeling to study again. And meanwhile, keep making notes, because notes are the ones which are the milestones. There you will realize what you have actually read, what you have actually done. And when you are done with all this course, I am sure that at the end of it you will be able to link all these works with these writers and with these eras in which they were published. All you will need is a quick revision of those notes that you have made. So it is a free course, absolutely free, no charges at all, and all I want from you is your complete attention. That is also the reason why there is no video in this course, because video will make you focus on the screen and I will only be just a voice at the back of your head. So I just want to be with you while you are listening to me now, and just keep listening to me. Keep your phone away, put on your earphones and take out your notebook and pen, and let us start making the notes. So let us start with the Old English poetry. Before the coming of Christianity, poems were composed and presented orally, and then they were only used to preserve the folklore or the culture of those people. And most of the early poetry, like Beowulf or the Battle of Maldon, etc., it is concerned with the heroic battlefeats of those days, and some of them is only lyrical. Now, those poets, they used a very special thing in that poetry, which is kennings. Kennings used to be these descriptive metaphors or these crystallized metaphors, which used to replace one word with another few set of words. For example, just let me tell the reason first, because poets in those days, they were always talking about the same things and always making their poems on the same themes, like spears, kings, battles, swords, earth, etc., sun, and all these were the words that did not begin with the same letter, and they had to find a solution in order to find a rhythm or a rhyming scheme in their poetry or their works. And therefore they realized that that the compound words, that making a set of 2 or 3 words, it will make a rhyme, and it will also be something beautiful to look at. For example, calling the sea as Whale Road, WHALEROAD, calling sea as the road of the whales or the whale road, or also the sail road, or also as the fish bath, the bath of the fishes. They were very creative, those people, and they called the ships of those days as sea stallion. Stallion means a horse, so sea stallion means a horse in the sea, or they would also call it the sea stag. Like stag was an animal in that region, and they used to call it that, the sea stag. These were the kennings which were used. Now alliteration was there, like 4 or 5 stressed words might begin with the same consonants. For example, who, he, fairly, fleet of Ogton, like 2, 3 words would repeat and alliterate. Then repetition was also there, as I said, as in Hebraic poetry of the Old Testament. There was also this rapid narrative style. What is this? It means that those poems would talk about even the sword or the horse, about that main character, for around 100 pages. That was the rapid narrative style. Like unnecessary details were there in them, but still they were not as much as they used to be in the epic poetry before them, but still there was this long details in them. So although it was the rapid narrative style in their words, but still if we compare it to nowadays, it is still a very long narrative style. Next we see some of these works in that time. Beowulf, as I told you, the Battle of Maldon, and Deor's Lament, which was around 500 AD. It is a melancholic lyric of a bard or a scop who has lost the favor from his mentor or his king, who has been paying him to write those works. So that bard is now making this Deor's Lament. Then next is the Wife's Lament, which was again it came out in the Exeter book. This Exeter book was actually a collection of all these old English poetries, and it was released. I think it was collected in around 800 AD. So Wife's Lament also is a bitter lyric of a wife who is living with hostile relatives after her husband has been captured in the battle. Then the Seafarer is there. It is also in the Exeter book, and it is a doleful monologue by a sailor who is complaining of the cold northern sea and its fearful storms. Next we have is the famous work. Let's talk about the Beowulf. It was published in 750 AD and composed in Northumbria. Then the anonymous author is there. Nobody knows the author of Beowulf poem. It is a very epic poem, and it was written in around the year 1000 in Wessex by an Anglo-Saxon. We don't know the person exactly, but we know that he had training in the church and he understood the royal court of that time, and he also knew the folklores of that time, and he also had a good command of the techniques of that Anglo-Saxon poetry. But some believe that that person was not a true Anglo-Saxon. He was a foreigner who learned that language there and then created this epic work Beowulf. Now there are many allusions to Bible in Beowulf, and we don't have to go in the details, just remember this. Cultural confusion was there, and also the author, for example, seems to equate God with all the concepts of the fate. For them, God was not Jesus Christ. God was the fate of somebody. That was the God. And if you talk about the manuscript of Beowulf, well, it is present in the British Museum, and the only surviving manuscripts of Beowulf, they are present in the British Museum, and they survived this great fire of London in 1731. And now replicas have been made successfully, but the only original manuscript lies in the British Museum. The historical evidence is also there, like Hygelac's raid on the Frisians was there. Frisians are the people who live on the west coast of the Holland, or what you call today's the Netherlands. That is and the west coast of Netherlands is where the Frisians used to live. And also the Old English language is also similar to the Frisian language if you compare it today. Now the historical evidence is there in the Beowulf that it is comparable, and it talks about this raid of the famous king Hygelac on the Frisians. It happened during 512 to 520 AD, and it is the same thing in the Beowulf also. Now the Anglo-Saxon culture is there in Beowulf, that Thanes used to be there, and the importance of the relationship between these Thanes and his lord. Thanes were the warriors of that time, and there were the great loyalty and the great submissive attitude of those warriors towards their ruler or towards their lord. There was this great virtue of courage and devotion. It used to be talked about in all that great poetry. A monster named Grendel raids Hrothgar's court, and he kills all those people who are there, many people. He kills everybody. He kills not everybody, he kills a few men every time he comes there. Then Beowulf, a great warrior, he is from the Geats community, Geat, Geats. He is summoned, he is called there to kill that monster, because people talk about his great strength, that his hands are so powerful that he can rip apart anything. And then he is summoned there to kill that monster, and then he does that by wrenching off his gigantic arms, like he pulls out the arm of that monster with his bare hands. Then Beowulf also fights the monster's mother, Grendel's mother, which is found in the underwater, and then he finds this magical sword, and he slays her, he kills that mother, slays her with that magical sword which he finds there in the sea. Now, the third story is also there about Beowulf, that he dies while fighting a dragon. So Beowulf is a great character in that Anglo-Saxon world, because they say that Beowulf was found in a boat with a lot of treasure in it when he was a young child. So somebody sent him in that boat, and that was the tradition of these people. They used to send their dead warriors in boats, or their rulers in boats, and along with their pets or their slaves, and they used to fire that boat when it had reached a certain distance, so that burning boat would travel across and the dead body would just perish somewhere in the water or in the air. Now, I've told you already about the Beowulf. Well, there were other old Christian poetry, like The Dream of the Rood is a great poem in which Christ is described as a young hero, and this rood is like the cross on which Christ was hung, and he was killed on that cross. So that rood is lamenting, he is crying and weeping, and he is dreaming that Christ may be resurrected. Now, there are three main poets who people say used to exist. One is Caedmon, Caedmon. The poet Caedmon, he is talked about by another poet who is known as the Venerable Bede. I'm sorry. So Venerable Bede, he talks about Caedmon in the Ecclesiastical History of the British Nations. It was written in 731, and this book tells about the poet Caedmon. He says that he composed great verses and great poems. So Caedmon used to write these hymns. Caedmon used to be this very illiterate shepherd, this person who used to graze his sheep in those days, in those lands. And they say that whenever he would sit among all those peoples at night, among his family, they would keep singing all these great poetry, and he would just sit there and he would be shy and he would be depressed that why God you cannot grant me to make good poetry. And suddenly one night he has this great dream in which Jesus comes to him and gives him the idea of how the world was created and all that, about the creation. So he remembers that entire poem which Jesus spoke to him in his dream, and then he speaks that poem next day at his dinner table or in their mead halls, and that is which is known as Caedmon's hymns. So if we talk today, only a 9-line Caedmon hymn is left today. Rest of it has vanished or extinct. We have lost it, but yeah, that is it. So we should sing, there is this excerpt from that line. We should sing how he, the eternal Lord, set up a beginning of every wondrous thing. This is how they used to say it. Now other poems are also ascribed or dedicated to Caedmon. The Junius manuscripts, which was published in 950, contains these poems with the subjects of the Bible, which the Venerable Bede had connected with Caedmon. So the poems are Genesis, Judith, and Exodus. Genesis talks about the 22 chapters of the Old Testament. If you remember, Saint Augustine took those. Saint Paul took the Old Testament and converted it into New Testament. Then Genesis talks about those 22 chapters of that Old Testament. Then comes the Judith poem, which is a fragmentary poem because we have lost the rest of the poem. It is a fragmentary poem which talks about the beheading of the Assyrian commander by the lovely widow Judith. Judith is a widow who kills the great commander when he tries to harass her physically. Next poem is Exodus, which talks about the story of how the Israelites they had to move out from Egypt to their promised land, which is Jerusalem today. So they traveled across that Red Sea and all of that, how the great Noah made them travel from there to there. So Exodus is about all that. Exodus, Judith, Genesis, they were by Caedmon, and they were talked about in the Venerable Bede's Ecclesiastical History of the British Nation, and also the Junius manuscripts, which are published in 950 AD. Next, let's talk about another poem, The Dream. We have talked about The Dream of the Rood. Let's talk about King Alfred the Great, who is one of the greatest kings or the rulers of that Anglo-Saxons. Why is the greatest? Not because he conquered many lands, but because he preserved their tradition, he preserved their culture, which we can access today. That is why somebody becomes great. So King Alfred the Great, 849 to 900 BC, we dedicate many things to him, and he actually ordered the translations of all the previous great works which were there. For example, the Pastoral Care by Pope Gregory was translated. Then the Universal History was translated, which was written by Paulus Orosius. Then the Venerable Bede's Ecclesiastical History was also translated by Alfred. Then also he translated Boethius's work, which was concerning the consolation of philosophy. So that is what King Alfred the Great translated. He also translated some poems from the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle. For example, the Battle of Brunanburh, Brunanburh. It was translated. Then also the Battle of Maldon was translated by him. There is this great giant leader, Elderman Berthorth. I can't speak these names, they are very difficult to speak. And he was there in the Battle of Maldon. And the Battle of Maldon, the poem, it describes his great heroic feats. Then was another poet, Aelfric, Aelfric. He was educated under King Alfred's direction, and he was a gifted prose writer. If you know, prose and verse are two different things. Prose means a paragraph, and verse means a rhythmic structure like a poetry or any kind of rhythm. So prose writer he was, Aelfric, and he was from 955 to 1020 AD. And he produced these translations from the Old Testament, and he also gave these texts on grammar and mathematics. Then another writer was there, Wulfstan. 53 sermons he gave, and the famous one is Wolf's Sermon to the English, WOLF, Wolf's Sermon to the English, in 1014 AD. And this sermon talks about the forceful and elegant Old English prose. Next we have is the medieval England. This is when we have the three great poets. It is the time after the Norman conquest, after the great William of Normandy conquered the England, and he ruled that for some time, and then the great three main poets come in during the medieval England. The Pearl poet, William Langland and Geoffrey Chaucer. And there is also the John Wycliffe, who produced the Bible. So there were Canterbury Tales produced during this time, we know that. And so let's talk about the Middle English as a language. In around 1000 AD, the opening words of the Lord's Prayer were written in Old English. That's not important. In the Wycliffe Bible, which was published in 1389, they used to talk about that Lord's Prayer at all, etc. Then we have Sir Walter Scott's novel Ivanhoe, which talks about this character Sir Walter Scott's novel Ivanhoe, it talks about this character Wamba. Wamba notes that although these cow, sheep and pig and deer, these are words from Old English, but these words are used in the modern language as well. So you can understand it that in those days the high class people, or the people from France or Normandy who had come and conquered England, their language became the language of the court, the language of the high people, high society, and the language of the low class people, like the people who were making food for these people or who were farming for these people. Their language became the low class, and it combined actually, and it formed the new English language which developed. It formed the Middle English language. So let's talk about John Wycliffe's Bible. John Wycliffe lived from 1328 to 1384. He was an Oxford theologian and also a religious reformer. And when he saw that all these churches were granting these pardons, free pardons to everybody, like if somebody has done a sin, he was not to be punished, but he will be exempted from that sin if he is able to bribe that churchman or that clergyman with maybe some sheep or some gold or some of his land. So that is how the corruption had reached a high level in those days. Corruption has always been there. So John Wycliffe identified it, and as a religious reformer, he formed this great group which we call as Lollards, Lollards. This Lollard movement, he started it, and through this he attacked the church's power. What they did is he sent out these simple devoted men who were called as Lollards, and they used to go in different parts of the England, and they used to preach people in their native language, and they would reveal the true sense of those Bibles and the truths of that religion. So many of these Lollards were captured and brutally beaten and even killed in those days. And it all happened during the fourth quarter of the 14th century, like the 1375 to 1400 AD. Now there are some links with literature in the John Wycliffe. He published the famous Bible, and there are two versions of this Bible, 1382 and 1395. It was probably the work of Nicholas of Hereford and John Purvey, but people dedicate it to John Wycliffe. Nicholas of Hereford and John Purvey were two Lollards who were constantly working under John Wycliffe, and sometimes people dedicate this Wycliffe Bible to them, but actually most of us agree, most of the people agree that it is a work by John Wycliffe. And King James also, who ordered the original or the official version of Bible, he also took most of that data or most of that stuff from Wycliffe's Bible. I'll talk about that King James Bible later on. Now let's talk about the Pearl Poet. The Pearl Poet gave many poems. First poem is Pearl itself. It talks about the death of the poet's 2-year-old daughter. Then another poem by the Pearl Poet is Purity, or you can call cleanness, and it talks about those stories of flood in the Bible and the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah and the fall of Belshazzar. And it also, there is another poem, Patience, which talks about the evils of impatience by retelling that story of Jonah in a humorous way. And he also gives a realistic picture of a whale's interior. In those days they could know, and they created this verse or this poem about the inside, that how a whale looks from inside, in the Pearl Poet's work Patience. Then we have the famous work Sir Gawain and the Green Knight. This elegantly constructed vivid narrative poem, it's a narrative poem. It is attributed by some to the Pearl Poet, but some people think that somebody else has done it. So there is no fixed. Most of these works in the ancient and the Middle English, their authors are not certain. So Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, in that Arthur's court is there, King Arthur's court is present, and somebody comes in riding in that court, and he challenges King Arthur for a duel or a fight, and then this great knight of the king, he says, Sir Gawain, he says that I'll take the challenge on behalf of my king. So if you can defeat me, then you will reach the king. So the strange, mysterious person who has come in the court, he accepts that challenge, and then he says that yes, try to kill me. So first he gives the chance to Sir Gawain. He says that first you will attack me with your sword, and then I will attack you with my sword. So that is a very easy thing for Sir Gawain. So when he killed that man, when he struck his sword in him, he did not die. So then he said that I can kill you at any moment, but I am sparing your life for 1 year. So just do anything that you want for 1 year, and do whatever your things are left, like your family might need you, you might need to arrange some funds, marry your children maybe. Then come to me in some forest, and there I will kill you. So Sir Gawain agrees to him. He accepts that challenge, and then he goes on for this knightly quest, Knightly, knightly. It's not Nightly. So this knightly quest happens. He sets out to fulfill his pledge but then he loses his way on the to the forest where he was supposed to reach, and he comes to this castle where he is welcomed by this great lord and his beautiful wife. And also this he the then they plan that whatever we get during the day we will share with each other. So the king sets out on a hunt. He brings a boar and he offers it to the knight, and the knight on the other hand is lured by the king's lustful wife, and he kisses her, and he is very repentful of that sin. So when that king comes in and shares his hunt, the Sir Gawain, the knight, he shares his kiss. He kisses that king on the cheek, and he says that yes, this is what I earned today. So he is able to control himself, and he does not go to bed with that lady, but still that lady manages to kiss him, therefore slightly ruining his quest. So when he reaches the magical person, the stranger, that stranger actually is a green person that is in some green, covered in green colors. So when he reaches that person only gives a small scratch to Sir Gawain, and he lets him go. He says that this scratch is because you let that woman kiss you. Otherwise, you are the best knight, and your story will be spoken throughout the history. So that was the great story of Sir Gawain and the Green Knight. Next we have the famous work Piers the Plowman. People believe that it has been written by William Langland, but still the authorship is not sure. Some people believe that it is attributed to the Pearl Poet. So Piers the Plowman is the complete title is The Vision of William Concerning Piers the Plowman, and it is actually a death vision, a dream vision, in which the basic content I'll tell you. The poet, this Piers, he dreams of a tower on a hill, and the dungeon also, and also a valley. So he's saying that there is a fair field, there is a green field which is full of people who are sitting in between a dungeon which is in the valley, and also a tower on the hill. So that tower represents God, that God lives in the tower, and the devil lives in the dungeon. So people are confused which side to go. This is the story of William Langland. So then William Langland, he becomes Jesus. Somehow he thinks that he is Jesus. He guides those people to the tower. That is the story. Then the importance of it is that in the Canterbury Tales, after the Canterbury Tales, it is the most important work in those days. Let's talk about Geoffrey Chaucer and his work. So there are three periods of Geoffrey Chaucer actually: French period, Italian period, and English period. During the French period, he wrote The Book of the Duchess, 1369, Parliament of Fowls. It was a poem on Saint Valentine's Day, celebrating the royal betrothal. That is why we celebrate the Valentine's Day, because of this poem, The Parliament of the Fowls. Next, he also translated the poetry of Roman de la Rose into English. It was his most popular among the French works. Then comes the Italian period. In the Italian works of Chaucer, we have Troilus and Cresside, and we have the Boccaccio's story Philostrato, which has been adapted by him. Other poems which are also there, like The House of Fame and The Legend of Good Women. These are the Italian period works. Then is his most famous, the English period, Canterbury Tales. Canterbury Tales comprises of 17,000 lines, and in that it is when they return to London. So it has been, the design is similar to Boccaccio's Decameron. Boccaccio was an Italian poet. His Decameron was famous, and he took that design of Canterbury Tales from Boccaccio. Now it was written in the rhymed couplets, and 24 stories, 4 of these unfinished, had been written when Chaucer died in 1400. So most people talk about the general prologue of Canterbury Tales, that 29 pilgrims are there in the Tabardin. But today if somebody asks in exam how many pilgrims are there, you say 30, because the narrator himself is also there. So 29 pilgrims at the Tabardin, Southwark, The narrator is not the Harry Bailey. It is Chaucer actually, the one who is writing. So Chaucer is also present there. So in total there are 30 pilgrims. So everything happens at the Tavern, and which is at Southwark. People are going to their famous Canterbury. Like people are going to this. What do we like? We go to Vaishno Devi temple. That is how they are going to Canterbury. So. So there are all these characters in that, like the wife of Bath. There is this prioress, poor parson. You can read in detail about this work later. This was a brief introduction I'll give you over here. Like I'll tell the key tales to you. First, let me tell about the characters. Wife of Bath is there, a freewheeling feminist figure in those days. And also there is the poor parson, the only churchman which Chaucer likes, because all the rest of those are corrupted. Chaucer, then he talks about the miller, who is a harsh person and who is always ready to quarrel with people or fight with people. Then there is the prioress, who is a dainty and a pretentious person. And also then there is the monk, the summoner and the friar. All these people are there. There are these tales also which you should know. The Miller's Tale. The Miller's Tale talks about the story of a husband who has been cheated by some people, who has been cheated, and this husband actually he is a reeve, and reeve is also there in the Canterbury Tales. So the Miller tells a story of a reeve who is cheated by some lover of his wife, and then he offers his wife to that person. Then the reeve retaliates and he tells the story of a miller in return as a revenge, and that the miller slept with the lady of the miller, the reeve. That is how they used to say the story. Then the wife of Bath tells the tales. She tells that what do women most desire, and it is that they desire the complete ownership over their husband or their partner. Then the Lothely lady is there, which tells her the same answer, that women desire their husband. Then the clerk tells the story of the patient and the obedient Griselda, who withstands the trials which were meted out by a relentless husband. Then the merchant tells a tale of an old man who is married to a young wife, and then he goes blind, and then wife is lamenting and she's crying. Then the pardoner tells his tale, and in which he tells a sermon, and the story is of three young men who set out to find death and destroy death. So pardoner's tale is about three people who find death and destroy him. Then the nun priest tale come, and in the pardoner's tale, please remember, death destroys those people and they are unable to destroy death. So the nun priest tale happens in which a cock is there and he is captured by a fox. So you can read about these stories more, it is important. Next we come to the Renaissance period, or the age of Elizabeth, or the great age of Shakespeare, etc. In this we talk about the Tudor poets like Sir Thomas Wyatt, Henry Howard, and who was the Earl of Surrey. So in this time Latin and Greek poems were there, and the famous style was terza rima and ottava rima. So Shakespearean sonnets were there, and the Renaissance miscellanies were there. Now Total's miscellanies were produced, in which contained 97 poems by Sir Thomas Wyatt and 40 poems by Earl of Surrey or Henry Howard. So these Tudor poets have written these famous Total's miscellany. Now there is another thing, that the Thomas Wyatt in these Total's miscellany, he wrote about the Petrarchan sonnets, and Henry Howard wrote about the translations of Aeneid in 1554 in the blank verse. Now come to Edmund Spenser. He lived from 1552 to 1599. He talks about the Fairy Queen. There are book 1 to 3, book 4 to 6. Like book 1 to 3 they were published separately in 1590, and book 4 to 6 they were published 6 years later in 1596. So now people compare the work of Edmund Spenser to Dante Alighieri. He was an Italian person who wrote this famous work, uh, Divine Comedy. So you can read that also. 13th or 14th century work, I think. So Fairy Queen is mostly compared to Dante's Divine Comedy, and it planned 11 moral virtues were there. But only 6 books were compared, so he could only portray 6 virtues. Now there are various allegories in that, because vanity or the Queen of Pride or the gluttony, these kind of characters are there in the Fairy Queen. Now Sir Philip Sidney comes in, and he is also an example there in the Fairy Queen. The Red Cross Knight in the Fairy Queen represents Sir Philip Sidney. We'll talk about Sidney. He was a great man. He died giving water to the opposite kind of soldier, because he thought that he cannot be saved. He has been hurt more than that. He cannot be saved now, and then his water should be given to some other person who can be saved. Now Neoplatonism was there, the philosophy of Neoplatonism, which was widely held in the Renaissance. It talks about finding permanence in the ever-changing world of nature by like practicing all these virtues which were talked about in Fairy Queen, etc. So the Spenserian stanza is there. Rhyming scheme is like AB, AB, BC, BCC. And the Spenserian stanza, it's of 7 lines. Sorry, it's a 9-line stanza. First 8 lines are in the iambic pentameter, and the last line is an Alexandrine. Alexandrine is like an iambic hexameter. So other works by Spenser are the Shepherd's Calendar 1579, which includes 12 eclogues, and the Ocritus is also one of them. Another works by Edmund Spenser are Amoretti, another poems 1595. It is a sonnet sequence which celebrates the poet's courtship of Elizabeth Boyle, his wife. Then Epithalamion and Prothalamions, they are there. They were also for his wife, Miss Boyle. Prothalamion, people believe it's for Queen Elizabeth, but they are not sure. Because his wife is also named as Elizabeth Boyle. He proposed Queen Elizabeth in those days, but she rejected him, and instead he was presented with his own great castle in some other place in other nearby country, I think Scotland, where it was burned down because he was found spying for Queen Elizabeth. So that was about Edmund Spenser. And other Elizabethan poets are there, like Edward de Vere. He was the 17th Earl of Oxford, and he wrote the sonnets like who taught thee first to sigh, who told you first to who has teached you to be sad. This is a famous work of Edward de Vere. Another lyric is that if women could be fair. Next writer is Sir Edward Dyer, 1550 to 1607. His work is My Mind to Me a Kingdom Is. Next writer is Nicholas Britton. He talks about Phillida and Corydon. Next writer is Thomas Ledge, who wrote this Rosalind poem. It was a prose romance, actually. Sorry, it was a prose romance which contained the sonnets and eclogues, and it was the source of Shakespeare's As You Like It. Thomas Ledge's Rosalind was the source of Shakespeare's As You Like It. Next we have Samuel Daniel. Samuel Daniel from 1562 to 1619, if you want to write down, although it's not important. So although the content of his verse lacked the originality, he was noted for his artistry with the language. And his famous work is Delia, D-E-L-I-A, Delia, which is a sequence of 50 sonnets. He took English poetry as a giant step forward with the Complaint of Rosamond. Another work, The Complaint of Rosamond, which was a monologue in the Rhyme Royal stanza. You can remember that. Next writer we have is Michael Drayton, who wrote Ideas Mirror, Mirror. It's not mirror, mirror, I think. Ideas Mirror. Then another work, Idea, The Shepherd's Garland, 1593. And another is the collection of some another more pastoral eclogues. Next writer is Thomas Campion, 1567 to 1620. He was also a very innovative poet, and he wrote 4 books of airs, AIRS, which were poems which were written to be sung. And then another work of Thomas Campion is When to Her Lute Corinna Sings, and also There is a Garden in Her Face. Now we come to the Cavalier poets, and now there is this tribe of Ben, we call it. They are collectively called as the tribe of Ben because they were greatly influenced by Ben Jonson, and they were sophisticated poets who supported the king and opposed the Puritans. So who are these tribes of Ben? There is Robert Herrick, there is Thomas Carew, there is Sir John Suckling, and Sir Richard Lovelace. Richard Lovelace is not a knight, he is not Sir. So Robert Herrick wrote To the Virgins to Make Much of Time, and he also wrote Corinna's Going A Maying A / Maying Maying. He also wrote Upon Julia's Clothes. Next we come to Thomas Carew. He wrote Ask Me No More Where Joy Bestows. Joy was not Joy, it used to be written as Joye. So Ask Me No More Where Joy Bestows, that where it resides. Next writer, Sir John Suckling, 1609 to 1642. He wrote So Why Pale and Wan, Fair Lover. Next writer, Sir Richard Lovelace, 1618 to 1658. He wrote the famous lyric To Lucasta Going to the War. In that he asserts that I could not love you because I loved honor more and I have to fight the battle. Therefore, I had to leave you at the house. So he writes this poem to his wife Lucasta. Richard Lovelace. Next we have are the metaphysicals, John Donne. Now John Donne, he wrote many famous works, and he usually talked about these rotting corpses. They appear in these love poems. Like, he was a very different kind of poet altogether. T.S. Eliot has also praised him so much because of his completely witful and artistic nature. Now the imagery in those days was used to be far-fetched imagery, far-reaching allusions were there which broke the norms of the society and which reached somewhere else. For example, the flea poem was there, in which the flea was supposed to mix the bloods of 2 lovers in her stomach, and when the woman was denying the lover of intercourse, then the lover says that our blood has already been mixed in the stomach of this flea, and therefore why are you afraid of this thing? So that is the extent of John Donne's far-fetched imagery. So the famous works are Go and Catch a Falling Star. It talks about the impossibility of finding a faithful woman. Then the poem The Indifferent is there, which is spoken by a bachelor who demands inconsistency in love. Then another work is A Valediction Forbidding Mourning, a very famous work which might be asked. It is a love poem which was written as Donne went on to a journey, and then he uses this metaphor of a compass to compare 2 lovers, that we are separated but at the end we are going to be one. So that is how he tries to compare 2 lovers in The Valediction for Forbidding Mourning. I've already told you the flea. Then there is the ecstasy. Ecstasy is a mystic religious experience of the joining of the souls of 2 lovers. Then there is also the canonization. It is a very famous poem. He says that people are stopping us from loving, but they don't know that we are the great lovers and will never die, or will keep living even after our deaths. That is how he tells it. So canonization is there, the philosophical love poem. Then there is Good Friday, 1613, Riding Westward. And the Good Friday, 1613, riding westward, it makes the poet turn his back to crucifixation, the crucifixion in order to receive correctness. Then he also wrote holy sonnets, which include Death Be Not Proud, and also Better My Heart, Batter, Better My Heart. Also Three-Personed God, Three-Personed God, THREE slash PERSONNED, Personed God. He also wrote the Litany, Litany, it is a it is a rhapsodic lyric about the power of the church. Then we have the next writer, metaphysical, George Herbert, 1593 to 1633. He writes religious poetry and he demonstrates a deep religious faith in the virtue. Then the poem is there, the virtue, and also there is the collar. Then he also writes the temple in 1633. So these are his famous works. Then we have Richard Crashaw. He wrote The Flaming Heart and Steps to the Temple. Then we have Henry Vaughan, who wrote The Retreat. Then we have John Milton. John Milton lived from 1608 to 1674. He is the most famous person or the poet of that age because he composed the great epic which was known as Paradise Lost. So he lived in the time which was between Renaissance and the Commonwealth period. So his writings combine the restless intellectual spirit of the Renaissance with the later emphasis on religion and politics in the Commonwealth. So both the themes are combined by John Milton. Religious themes are there. Now let's talk some early poems of Milton. El Allegro, L apostrophe then Allegro, El Allegro, Il Penseroso, Lycidas. These are the poems by John Milton, early poem. Then he also wrote some prose, and the prose is Areopagitica, 1644, and Of Education in 1644, the same year. Then he wrote the famous work Paradise Lost. This is Milton's monumental work, the most epic, which was written in 12 books, and it is a superb blank verse. Now, it is based on the Bible and other writings which were available in that period of Renaissance, etc. This epic begins with the fall from heaven of these rebel angels like Satan, etc. These angels have been thrown away from the heaven and they continue to fight against the gods. Their temptation to spoil the gods' biggest creation, which is Adam and Eve. So they ruin the creation of God. Then we have 23 sonnets of Milton, which are they are very great, and only Shakespeare has managed to write better sonnets than him. It is believed that. And among those sonnets, some of them are like when I consider how my light is seen. This is about serving God when he has become blind. And his another sonnet is How Soon Hath Time. Later works are also there about Milton, not so famous, but it is Paradise Regained and also Samson Agonistes. Samson Agonistes is like a Greek tragedy when Samson's downfall is shown in that work. Then we have other Commonwealth poets. We have Oliver Cromwell, who used to write in the time of Commonwealth. Commonwealth period is also known as the Free State period, 1649 to 1660. And the pro-Commonwealth was also known as parliamentarians, and the person who wanted the king to rule were known as the royalists. So the people there who one side supported the king, they were known as the royalists, and the people who supported the parliament, this were the parliamentarians. So parliamentarian poets was Andrew Marvell, and the royalist poets were Abraham Cowley and Edmund Waller. So the parliamentary poet Andrew Marvell, 1621 to 1678, he wrote the famous work Upon the Death of His Late Highness the Lord Protector in 1658. Another work is To His Coy Mistress in 1681. And it is also a carpe diem poem that just go and seize the day, just do whatever you want to do not be afraid of the society or what people will think of our love. He's just trying to influence his partner or his lover in that song. And there is also an example of the Ganga river in that, Ganges. He was neglected for 2 centuries actually, and only after World War II, when T.S. Eliot published his essay Andrew Marvell, then only his works were they came to the light. They were praised or they were considered. Then we have the royalist poets like Abraham Cowley and Edmund Waller. Abraham Cowley wrote The Mistress in 1647, and also the lyric which was titled The Welsh. No, it was titled The Wish. He is also praised for his Pindaric odes. Abraham Cowley, you can remember that. These were the irregular odes which imitated John Dryden. Then we have Edmund Waller from 1606 to 1687, and he was influenced by Ben Jonson, and he wrote in the Cavalier poets tradition, the Cavalier poets, and he wrote this famous work Go Lovely Rose, and also On a Girdle, O-N then Girdle, Girdle. Then John Dryden, he praised the sweetness of Edmund Waller, and he called him as the father of English numbers. Numbers are actually what you call as meter in today's language. So the father of English number or the father of English meter. This is what John Dryden called Edmund Waller. So this now we come to the drama of the Renaissance period, which is the most famous work. Now they were written in the blank verse mostly, and there was these comedies of Plautus and Terence, and the tragedies of Seneca. These were the basis of all these works. And the revenge tragedy was a famous tradition, like Hamlet was there. Female roles used to be played by young boys because women were not allowed to act on the stages in those days. The only play where women started acting on the stages was the first play by Shakespeare, which is Romeo and Juliet. There is a movie also, Shakespeare in Love. If you watch that movie, you'll see that in that Romeo and Juliet, the Juliet is actually the girlfriend or the love interest of Shakespeare. Now, we have these famous interludes, and in the pre-Shakespearean drama, interludes were like small things. They were more comic and realistic at the same time, and heroes were more individualized. So we have these Henry Medwall and John Haywood. Both of them wrote interludes. Henry Medwall wrote Fulgens and Lucres in 1497, and John Haywood wrote the play called The Four Ps. It is a very famous work. It has been asked in the NET exam, I think, for the last 2 years also. So it's an important one. John Haywood, 1497 to 1580, wrote the Four Ps play. In the Four Ps, they are like the palmer, the pardoner, the apothecary, and the peddler. Now, one thing to remember here is that the Henry Medwall's Fulgens and Lucres is regarded as the first purely secular drama in English language. Now, coming to the pre-Shakespearean academic comedies, Nicholas Udall published the first one with Ralph Roister Doister. It is the name of the first academic comedy, Ralph Roister Doister, 1535. Then it was borrowed, or it was modeled on the Latin comedies of Plautus and Terence, Plautus and Trence, Terence. And also there is the anonymous work Gammer Gurton's Needle. It is also a famous academic comedy which can be asked. Then we come to the academic tragedies of the pre-Shakespearean drama, and these include the uh, famous works like Gorboduc or Ferex and Porrex 1561 to 62. These are the this is the work Gorboduc or Ferex and Porrex. Now Seneca was the model for these tragedies, and everybody tried to copy Seneca and produce the Senecan tragedies. Senecan revenge tragedies are the very famous works now. Thomas Sequel and Thomas Norton, uh, two lawyers, produced this Gorboduc, this tragedy, Gorboduc academic tragedy. Thomas Sackville and Thomas Norton, and it is also called as the first true English tragedy. So you can remember that, and please remember that it was written in blank verse. Then we come to the court dramas of the pre-Shakespearean times, and the pre-Shakespearean court dramas include George Gascoigne, Gascoigne. G is silent here. So George Gascoigne's work Supposes, Supposes. It is considered as the first court drama in those days. Then there was one more of it. Richard Edwards wrote another court drama. He wrote many court dramas, but among them, the famous one is Damon and Pythias, Damon, and Pythias, Pithias. It was published in 1571. And John Lilly, Lylly, he was the author of Euphues, which is also a good drama, or a good court drama, you can say. Now coming back to the drama in the public theatre, the pre-Shakespearean drama in the public theatres. What were the famous ones? Here you will find almost all the works of the university wits. Who are they? John Lilly, his famous work is Galathea, Galathea. It was in 1588. It was the first English use of the device in which girls are disguised as boys. So if somebody asks that which was the play where girls were disguised as boys, then it is John Lilly. Now George Peele, I would like to call it Peele. George Peele, he wrote the famous The Old Wives' Tale, published in 1590. It's a dramatic fairy tale, and it initiated actually the Elizabethan romantic comedy, the rom-coms, famous rom-coms. Now the Robert Greene's famous work, The Honourable History of Friar Bacon and Friar Bungay, Bungay, Friar Bacon and Friar Bungay, 1594. And here the heroine is, the character of the heroine, Margaret, is a famous one. It is also a romantic comedy, and notable for all the, especially for the heroine Margaret. Then came Thomas Kyd's work. Thomas Kyd did not go to any university, but he is still counted among the university wits because of his powerful works. The most powerful work is The Spanish Tragedy. It was published in 1586, and it was the first English revenge tragedy and the most popular play before 1600. Okay, and it also outdid Seneca in the violent horror, because Seneca's violent tragedies were known for showing extreme amount of violence and bloodshed on the stage. So Thomas Kyd's Spanish Tragedy is believed to have done even more violence and horror on the stage. And if you remember, Aristotle prohibited the use of, or this Horace and all these decorum writers, they always prohibited the use of any kind of violence on the stage. They wanted the plays to be nice, and if there is any violent scene, then it should not be shown. Just a messenger should come on the stage, and he should tell people that, yeah, this happened to him, he cut his throat, he got killed there, and that is it. So violent plays were forbidden in the old days, but now they are doing them with dignity. So next writer we have with it is John Pickering, John Pickeryng, and his work is a new interlude of vice containing the history of Horseats. A new spelling is Newe, then interlude, Entrelude, of Weiss Contersinge, ConteYninge, The History of Horestes, Horestes. It was published in 1567 by John Pickering. And you know that these plays were also famous for their violence that they showed on the stage. Now, just to give you an idea about the violence on these stages, after the stage was cleaned after the play, the stages were found to be filled, or you can say littered, with all the bloody corpses on the stage. That is how violent and harsh these plays were. Another one of these is Thomas Preston's A Lamentable Tragedy, mixed full of pleasant mirth, containing the life of Cambyses, king of Persia. It was published in 1569. It's a long title. You can just write it down if you are doing it. Next we have is the Bard of Avon, famous Bard of Avon, William Shakespeare. And there are a very few clearly established facts about William Shakespeare. Now let's study his biography. He was married to Anne Hathaway, and he gave birth to twins. Then she gave birth to twins. Then he left his native Stratford and went to London in 1587, around 1587, we are not sure of the dates. Then he began writing plays, and Robert Greene's play Groatsworth of Wit 1592. It is spoken about him. He started acting in those plays. He was an actor in the beginning. So he acted in Robert Greene's Groatsworth of Wit 1592, and in that play people spoke of him as an upstart crow, beautiful with our feathers. That is what was spoken of him. Next work is Venus and Adonis 1563. It was his first published drama. Then we have Titus Andronicus, which appeared anonymously a year later, Y-E-R. Then he wrote 37 plays before retiring to Stratford, where he finally died on April 23rd, 1616. Let's look at his career as a poet. He wrote many sonnets, and his style was also different. Now, his sonnet sequence follows the lead of Sidney and Spenser, but he even outsmarts them or outshines them in the poetic quality and originality. Now, motifs are there in the sonnets, and what are the motifs there? The beauty of a young man is there, and the poet's involvement with him, like the poet or the writer, that is Shakespeare, he is involved with a young man. People believed that Shakespeare was a homosexual, and some of the movies they used to confirm it, but some of the movies also reject these claims. So there are mixed reviews on that. So the motifs in these various sonnets that he wrote, they included the beauty of a young man, and they also included a dark lady and a rival poet, and also the ravages of the time, and also the immortality of the art. Then some people say that his authorship is disputed, that he did not write those plays which he claimed to write in those days. People say that Herbert Lawrence Herbert Lawrence in 1769 argued for the first time that such an uneducated minor actor could not have produced these high quality dramas. Some people relate the credit to Christopher Marlowe, who was killed early in his life, and only after the end of Christopher Marlowe we see the great tragedies of Shakespeare. Now, theorists have proposed Sir Francis Bacon also as the possible writer of these works, and also the Earl of Oxford or Christopher Marlowe, as I told you guys. There is but no evidence to support all these kinds of conjectures or claims. Now let's look at the texts. What are all the texts? That all printed plays appeared in cheap quartos, like there were very cheap small penny magazines, in those they used to appear, and these plays appeared in 1623, and it is called as the first folio edition. 1623 first folio, remember that. Then it contained 36 plays, this also you should note down, which were divided arbitrarily into histories, comedies, and tragedies. And the third folio is there, which includes the famous work Pericles. Next we have are the Shakespeare's history plays. These are his starting points as a budding writer, and in this these history plays are also known as chronicle plays. And so let us look at the minor plays. There is Henry VI, and it was in three parts, part 1, 2 and 3. They were published from between 1590 to 1592. Then there is the Life and Death of King John, which was published between 1595 to 96. These are the melodramatic accounts of the royal power struggles during those chaotic periods of English history. Then comes the Tragedy of King Richard III. It is one of the major plays, and it is also called a chronicle play, just like I told you. This shows the fall of Prince's tragedy, and it depicts the hunchbacked Richard's violent route to the throne, that he did everything that he wanted to do just to reach or just to succeed Edward IV. Next we have the Tragedy of Richard II. It was in 1597. It relates the conflict between Henry Bolingbroke and Richard II. Then we have the first part of Henry IV, 1597. It talks about the drunken or the amoral character, but he was also a happy character, Falstaff, a very famous character of Shakespeare. And he talks about the wild young Prince Hal also, Prince Hal, who was the son of Henry IV. And Hal slays Hotspur also in this. Now, the second part of Henry IV was in 1598. In this also you see the comedy of Falstaff, etc. Then again the Life of Henry V, 1599. It was a patriotic play. It depicted Henry's triumphs in the French wars, and it also portrays him as an ideal ruler. So if somebody asks you who was the ideal ruler according to Shakespeare, then according to his plays it was the Henry V. Then we come to his comedies and romances, the rom-coms, famous romantic comedies and the rom-coms. So the last plays are actually dramatic romances, and the earlier plays are the problem comedies, romantic comedies, farces, mask fantasies, many of these things. So the Comedy of Errors, the first one of them, 1590 to 93, it was a farce about these two twin brothers are there, and one is left in one city, another is lost. So the father goes to find his lost son. On the way the second son also appears there, and it is a big comedy in that. Then we have the Two Gentlemen of Verona, 1590 to 94, and in this plot we find a disguised girl who is pursuing her lover, and this is the first time when he used this disguised girl. Then we have Love's Labour Lost, 1590 to 94. This is a satire on all the utopian concepts, and there are these characters like Biron, the first of Shakespeare's intellectual heroes. Like Shakespeare until now has already used courage as the only virtue of people, but here he uses intellect also, and the famous character is Biron. There is also a heroine, a witty heroine, Rosalind, in the Love's Labour Lost. Next we have A Midsummer Night's Dream, 1591 to 96. This is a mask fantasy. If you do not know what it is, please go and search it. It is best known for the mischievous elfin character which is named Puck, P-U-C-K, Puck. And also this comic person, he is an artisan who is known as Bottom. Then we have The Taming of the Shrew, 1594 to 97. It is again a farce, and in this the character Petruchio, a clever character, he tries to seduce the shrewish and mean-tempered Katharina, and it's a very elegant story, and Petruchio is finally able to control Katharina and make her fall in love with him. Now, next is The Merchant of Venice, 1596 to 97. It is a love affair between Bassanio and Portia. Portia is a famous heroine. If somebody asks you, she was in The Merchant of Venice. And now their love affair is actually gets complicated because Bassanio took a loan from Shylock, who demands his money and also a pound of flesh of Bassanio. And Portia, she disguises as a lawyer, and then she solves all this dilemma. Next we have is The Merry Wives of Windsor from 1598 to 1600. It was written for the Queen Elizabeth, who requested. She was so amused by that character Falstaff. The Falstaff, if you remember, Falstaff appeared in the which character? The first part of Henry IV. So she was so amused by that character Falstaff that she wanted a Falstaff comedy. So if somebody asks you which is a Falstaff comedy, then it is The Merry Wives of Windsor. In this work, Falstaff sends identical love letters to various wives in the Windsor. And finally, those wives find this out and they punish Falstaff at the end, and it is a very funny play according to those times. The next work is Much Ado About Nothing. It was published between 1598 to 1600. It is again a romantic comedy which features this witty debate between these two lovers. The name is Benedict and Beatrice. Both are determined to stay single, but they are constantly debating with each other, and just to stay and just to prove their points. Next of Shakespeare's comedies is As You Like It, 1599 to 1600. In this one, it is a pastoral comedy, and Touchstone is the first of Shakespeare's wise fools. Now there are wise fools of Shakespeare, and the first one is Touchstone. He appears in As You Like It. Next work we have Twelfth Night, or What You Will, 1600 to 1601. Again, a woman named Viola is dressed as a man in this romantic comedy, and there are two memorable comic characters in this work, Sir Toby Belch and Sir Andrew Aguecheek. Sir Toby Belch, Tobybelch, and Sir Andrew Aguecheek, Aguecheek. The next one is All Is Well That Ends Well, 1603. Now, after the 12th night, the musical work, the lyrical work, the comedies grew darker in tone. And Helena in this work, the lady Helena, she saves the life of King Bertram, Bertram, and she demands him as her husband. Then later on, she deceives him into fathering her child, which existed already. Next, we have Measure for Measure, 1604. It is a problem comedy, and it has Angelo as the character, and Angelo tries to save the life of the cursed or the condemned Claudio in exchange for some sexual favors from his sister Isabella, and a novice in a nunnery. Isabella is a novice in the nunnery, but Isabella refuses to Claudio that I will not go with Angelo, but through disguises and subterfuges the matter finally gets solved. Then we have Troilus and Cresside, in which there is a debate whether we can call it a comedy or a tragedy. It is very debatable because it talks about the Trojan War, and the action is very tragic, but the way that action is depicted is actually comic, and it is a satire, and though all these things suggest that it is a comedy, but people believe that it is a tragedy because it depicts the story of the Trojan War. Then we have the next work, Pericles, which is the Prince of Tyre, Tyre. Pericles, the Prince of Tyre, 1608. It is a dark comedy which is based on the premise that the wife of Pericles, Thaisa, she is mistakenly thought as dead while giving birth to a child, and then they try to bury her at the sea, but finally she gets up and people discover her. Then next work is Cymbeline, 1609 to 10, and it is a tragic comedy, something like Othello, And the pure Imogen, he is falsely accused of infidelity by the uh, villain who is like Iago. If you remember, Iago is a famous villain of Shakespeare. So Cymbeline, in that Imogen is there, and the villain is not Iago but Iachimo, Iachimo. Iachimo is just like Iago. Now, Imogen is a lady, and she finally manages to escape this Iachimo by taking the disguise of a page boy. Next one is The Winter's Tale 1610 to 1611. And in this dramatic romance, King Leontes, Leontes, King Leontes falsely believes that his wife Hermione has taken his friend Polixenes as a lover. He thinks that there is an affair going on between his wife Hermione and his friend Polixenes. So he tries to poison Polixenes, but Hermione is missed. Hermione, she is although she gets imprisoned for this deed, but then she gives birth to a child, and after so much time, with the help of an oracle, the story is finally resolved. There is a oracle who used to, the seers in those days existed, and one of those seers from Delphi comes in and he tells that no, your wife is very pure and that child that she gave birth to is yours, and you should not have killed that friend of yours, Polixenes. So finally it is the end, happy ending. The next work is The Tempest 1611. It is the last play of Shakespeare's comedies and romances. Now The Tempest, in this you will find that Shakespeare says farewell to the theatre symbolically, and Prospero is there. Prospero, the magician in the play, he is actually a form of Shakespeare only. Shakespeare tries to give his own role in the form of Prospero, and in that Prospero renounces the magic because he is a magician and he is trying to renounce the magic and returns to the real world. And the other characters, memorable characters in this Tempest are Ariel, who is a spiritual creature, not a human being, and also Caliban, who is a slave. So this is a very good work, Tempest, and it was his last play. Then we come to the tragedies of Shakespeare, who were also published during these times only. And the tragedies are the most famous works of Shakespeare, and these are believed to be the greatest tragedies ever written in the English language. The almost unearthly power they have, like the richness of his mind is shown in these, because the characters of these tragedies, they do not let any hint of Shakespeare come into those characters. Those characters stand on their own and they behave on their own, and people do not think that these are created by Shakespeare. They think that these are the true characters. For example, Hamlet. Now, these are the four great tragedies: Hamlet, Othello, King Lear, and Macbeth. He also wrote 6 other plays that can be categorized as tragedies, but and also some other historical plays also, but these are the 4 major ones, and all these tragedies come into the category of fall of princes tragedies. Now, the early tragedies before 1603 which he published are the tragedy of Titus Andronicus 1592 to 94. These were also they can also be related to the revenge plays of Seneca. In the tragedy of Titus Andronicus, Queen Tamora and her sons are there. They try to take revenge from Titus, a Roman general, a great Roman general. So Titus sacrifices one son, and Timora's revenge gets failed and foiled also. Then we have the tragedy of Romeo and Juliet, the famous romantic tragedy, and Shakespeare's first romantic tragedy, it seems. And in this we find the houses of Montague and Capulet, leading to the deaths of 2 star-crossed lovers. Romeo and Juliet are called as the star-crossed lovers. And Romeo and Juliet begins with the sonnet, which is spoken by the chorus, and in its poetic language, this chorus reflects the great interest in the sonnets in the 1590s. One more thing about Romeo and Juliet, it is the first play in which females started to play the role of females, because the lady female, she is supposed to be Shakespeare's girlfriend, who happens to be present in the enactment of this play. Then we have the tragedy of Hamlet, Prince of Denmark, 1601. This tragedy of revenge of a prince for the murder of his father, it goes even far beyond any of the Senecan revenge tragedies or any of the tragedies in time. And its philosophical complexity is so great then that even the modern or the postmodern critics are unable to clearly define or explain the character of Hamlet. Now, it is also one of the greatest works of English literary art. And in this work we find the glorious poetry and also the multi-layered characterization, such as Samuel Pepys in his diaries, which he wrote from 1660 to 1669. So Samuel Pepys' diary is very famous. I'll tell you, it is a reference. Samuel Pepys wrote his diary from 1660 to 1669, and in that he wrote about many great things during his life. One of them was the Great Fire of London, which destroyed many great works which could have been saved. And the tragedy of Hamlet also is talked about by Samuel Pepys, and in that he says that the best part is, I believe, that ever was acted. He calls it the best thing. Samuel Pepys used to go there and watch all of the plays of Shakespeare, which were even enacted even after his death for long time. So then we have some middle tragedies of his life, the middle tragedies of Shakespeare, the great triad of tragedies that Shakespeare wrote from 1604 to 1606. It depicts a world full of inscrutable and interesting evil, presented objectively and not broodingly and subjectively like in Hamlet. It's an objective evil which is shown to us. For example, in the tragedy of Othello, Moor of Venice, 1604. In this, it is one of the most poetic and best constructed tragedies of Shakespeare. And in this, you will find Othello has that three memorable characters: the heroic character Othello, and also the villain Iago, the most famous villain of Shakespeare till now, and also the pure and loving Desdemona, whose interaction is engendered by the envious Iago. Iago does not want Desdemona to go to Othello, but she loves Othello anyhow. It also describes Iago's soliloquy at the end of Act 5, Scene 3. And that soliloquy goes like, the motive hunting of motiveless malignity. You just can remember this. Then next we have the tragedy of King Lear, 1605 to 6. This is a tragedy of the fall of an old king, an aging king, a dying king, who is a petulant and unwise old man. He divides his kingdom in between his three daughters. Two daughters are bad, they are malicious, and they persuade him to disinherit the third daughter, which is the sincere daughter, Cordelia. And finally he realizes that this was a bad decision, because Cordelia was the best daughter of his. So it leads to the tragic ending of King Lear's madness. King Lear goes mad at the end, because when Cordelia gets hanged, Cordelia is being hanged, and the recovered King Lear is dying out of the sadness and the grief that what a bad father I am, that I ordered the hanging of my own daughter. Then we see the tragedy of Macbeth. It was in 1606, and in this we see that the cruel and empowering ambition of the Macbeth and also his wife Lady Macbeth. They kill the king, and then we see the most vivid picture of the Shakespeare's raw and naked evil. Now, there is also a prophecy by three witches in the beginning of the play, and Macbeth also attempts to stop that fallacy from going on, but still he cannot stop his destiny. Just like Oedipus could not stop his own destiny, similarly, Macbeth could not stop. And therefore, it happens that he kills the king, and finally, it's a tragic death for Macbeth also, because in the end, he is also killed by a guy who is born of no ordinary birth. Next, we have his later tragedies or his last tragic plays. First one is Antony and Cleopatra. The tragic love affair between the noble hero Antony and Queen Cleopatra, it destroys Antony but transforms Cleopatra from a selfish and a wanton girl to a true queen who dies triumphantly. Now, I'll tell you the story of this. Uh, Antony is the, I think, general of Julius Caesar, and he goes on an expedition, on an attack, and there he kills a king, and he finds his wife Cleopatra there. He falls in love with Cleopatra, and when Shakespeare realizes that his most trusted friend and general is losing his power in battle, then he tries to get his own sister married to Antony in order to divert his attention from Cleopatra. But Antony, nevertheless, does not marry, does not care for sister of Julius Caesar, and he sends her home to him. Then Julius Caesar attacks the kingdom of Antony and Cleopatra, and they both try to defend that kingdom. It is a battle in the sea. Warships are there, and they try to battle it out. But Cleopatra betrays Antony, and she takes her army and goes away. She runs away from the battle. Antony saves his life, goes to Cleopatra, and he says that this is not how a great person should live. And Antony, although he dies in the battle, but Cleopatra is transformed into a great queen, into a triumphant and legendary queen. So, next we have the life of Timon of Athens. It's 1605 to 08. It was published in the first folio, and this tragedy talks about the fall of the Timon. It's also considered as an incomplete. Next, we have the tragedy of Coriolanus. It was in 1606 to 8, and it is honored with the Coriolanus for capturing the town Corioli. Corioli is a name of a town, and this Roman general, he captures that town, and he is named as Coriolanus. Then suddenly the mob is there who are trying to get the hold of that town back, and then his own family, the general's family, it starts to disobey him. They start to insult him in front of him. Then suddenly the Roman general decides to take the side of the revolutionaries who are trying to take back the hold of this city Corioli, and finally he attacks his own family, and he crusades them, he kills them, and finally the revolutionaries win back their city. And in the end, Coriolanus also gets killed by the guards of those revolutionary leaders. Now, there are some other Elizabethan Jacobean dramatists. Number one is the main and the most talented contemporary of Shakespeare, Christopher Marlowe. He was born in 1564 and lived up till 1593. Marlowe's great poetic plays deal with consuming desire of a great overwhelming figure. He had a strong sense of the theatre, and he could move his audiences with great maneuvers, great stage maneuvers. Now, one of the most famous works, Tamburlaine the Great, part 1 was in 1587 and part 2 came in 1588. So, Tamburlaine is a ruthless and shepherd robber. He robs shepherds. So, he plots his bloody route to the throne of Persia, and you will see it. In the second part, his these bad conquests, they continue as he ravages Egypt and Babylon. And while Spencer was writing about the virtuous Christian knights, we heard about the Red Cross Knight in Spencer's famous works. At the same time, when Spencer was writing about these virtuous characters or these knights, at the same time Marlowe was he presented this consummate Renaissance egoist villain. Now, in one scene, or in the Tamburlaine imprisons the Turkish emperor and his empress in a cage, and then he kills them with very badly. Now he pulls out their brains against the bars of the cage. Then we have the tragical history of Dr. Faustus. It is a great play, Dr. Faustus. You must have read it if you have done the masters. The German scholar Faustus, he was bored with the conventional learning. He wanted all the power for him, all the knowledge that is there in the world. Therefore, in order to acquire all that power and knowledge, he sells his soul to the devil, to the Satan, for some superhuman powers. And then he misuses these powers by playing tricks on the Pope, and also he calls the Helen of Troy, the famous heroine Helen, the most beautiful woman that ever existed according to these myths of Troy. She calls that Helen, and then there is this famous line there that, was this the face that launched 1,000 ships? About Helen. This is the great story of Helen. If you don't remember the story of Helen, she ran away with the Prince of Troy, Paris, and then her husband, he came back to attack the city of Troy, and it was a devastating war and the most famous war. It was talked about by Homer in the famous works Iliad and Odyssey. Iliad. Next we have is in this work only, Lucifer is the person who is the assistant to the Satan or the devil, and Lucifer here claims his soul. Lucifer is also known as Satan. He is himself the devil, not the assistant. So Lucifer claims the soul of Dr. Faustus, and therefore at the end, when he is done with all these powers, he finally tries to repent. He tries to go back to Christ for his sins, but finally he dies in anguish. Then the next work of Christopher Marlowe is The Jew of Malta, Malta. It was in 1591. In this we see Barbadas is a famous character. And he has his wealth has been confiscated by the governor of Malta. So Barbadas tries to take back or his revenge on the governor of Malta, and his plot is like this, that he begins slaughtering so many people, in which his own daughter gets killed. His daughter's name is Abigail, and her lover is also killed, and she also gets poisoned in the end. And in the end, Barbados also dies by falling into a boiling cauldron, because the governor of Malta, he manages to make Barbados fall in that boiling cauldron or boiling container of oil. Next work from Christopher Marlowe, The Troublesome Reign and Lamentable Death of Edward II. This is a weak English king, Edward II, and he is involved in political intrigue and assassinated. People believe that this Edward II, he is infertile, etc., and therefore he is a very weak king. And this play also falls in the Fall of Princes tragedy. I'm sorry. Next work we have is from Ben Jonson, 1572 to 1637 he lived. He wrote these famous comedy of humors, and also his stock characters are very famous. Stock characters were the characters which were borrowed by other writers also to depict the same amount of laughter that can be shown on the stages. So the stock characters include cheeky slaves, miserly old sisters, and brass guard soldiers. They are always kept on the same place, and they keep fighting with each other. Now Ben Jonson's main play is Every Man in His Humour, 1598, and the stock characters are a jealous husband, a country bumpkin, and a deceived father, and simple squire. These are the stock characters. These might be asked in the exam. Now, it displays the fables of contemporary London life, and the character Esper in the Every Man in His Humor, he represents Ben Jonson himself. Next work of Ben Jonson is Volpone or the Fox. Volpone, or the Fox. This is the complete title. 1605 to 1606. Volpone is a rich Venetian merchant who pretends to be fatally ill in order to receive gifts from his acquaintances or people that he knows. So he falls ill, जानबूझ के बीमार हो जाता है और फिर then he hopes that people are going to gift him. It is considered as the greatest satiric comedy in English because it uses stock characters to expose the greed. And a secondary plot is also there in Volpone, in which Sir Politic Woodby is a name of a person. Sir Politic Woodby, he is an English traveler who has very absurd schemes for improving the trade and curing the diseases. Next play we have The Alchemist, 1610. In this, the character Subtle is there, Subtle, Subtle. So the character Subtle is there, who claims to be an alchemist. Alchemists were the magicians who can change anything to gold. So the character Subtle is there, who can change any metal to gold. Therefore, he can entrap all the greedy and all those bad people in the city who want to who are there to get all the metal and get it converted to gold, and then he finally punishes all those greedy people. This shows the Puritan mentality of those people, the Ben Jonson, in this Alchemist. Next writer we have is George Chapman, 1559 to 1634. He also wrote comic stuff, and the one work is All Fools, 1599 to 1604. It combines like two comedies by Terence into one comedy. Then we have John Marston, 1565 to 1634. He wrote the famous work The Malcontent, 1604. It is also a revenge tragedy, and it is completely filled with horror and revenge tragedy filled with, I think, violence also. Violence and horror both. Then we have Thomas Dekker, 1570 to 1632. He wrote one of the best loved English comedies, The Shoemaker's Holiday, and this is this was very much praised by Queen Elizabeth. Then we have Thomas Heywood, 1575 to 1641. He wrote the period's best domestic tragedy, and in this domestic tragedy, A Woman Killed with Kindness, this is the name, A Woman Killed with Kindness, 1603. And this work is a very great work. In this work, a man finds that his wife is having a love affair with somebody else, and instead of punishing her or trying to argue with her why you did it and all, he just simply silently makes her go away from him. And finally that woman, she realizes her mistake and she tries to return back to the person, and finally he does not take her back and she dies. So A Woman Killed with Kindness by Thomas Heywood. Next playwright we have is John Webster, 1580 to 1625. He wrote the famous work The White Devil, or the Vittoria Corombona. Vittoria Corombona is a lady. It is based on the real life murder story. And next work of John Webster we have is The Duchess of Malfi. It is also a historical work. Now, Webster pioneered in making women as the central figure in his plays, because none of the other playwrights were trying to do that. So that was the quality of John Webster. So that was all about the Renaissance period, friends. And in the next audio or the video lecture, you will see the Restoration and the 18th century literature.